everyone, today we are sewing up the MyUno pattern from Kite Creates as part of the November Marathon Society event. This pattern has lots of different options. You can sew it up with a handle, you can add a crossbody strap, it has pockets, it has a main zipper pocket opening, it uses a no tab zipper installation method, and it has a nice flat base. I'm going to be showing you an option today out of clear vinyl, so I am not going to be doing any lining and I am doing the handle-free option. So let's get going. I'm assuming when we start that you have cut out all of your pattern pieces. In addition to the pattern pieces that I'm using today, which is the exterior back, exterior top, and exterior front, I have also cut out an additional trim piece that I'm going to attach below my zipper that measures 1 inch tall and is equal in width to the exterior front of the pattern, 1 inch down from the upper edge piece of the lower exterior front section. I'm using waterproof canvas for my binding. I have 3 strips that each measure 8 inches by 1 inch, and I have 2 strips for the box corners that are 1 inch tall and 4 inches wide. Something else that I have done is add 1/8 of an inch to the height of my exterior front lower piece. This is to account for the bulk of the trim piece when we fold it over to top stitch, and also because when I use a size 5 zipper, I prefer to use a 5/16 of an inch seam allowance, which will allow me to keep my pattern piece the correct height when I'm finished. The corners of this pattern are nicely squared up. If you put your edge pieces for your exterior front, lower, and your exterior back beside each other, you can see that it makes a nice 180-degree angle, so we don't have to make any corrections in order to get this bag to sit flat on our surface when we're all done. I recommend marking your centers on all of your pattern pieces and your zipper tape before we start. Generally, I like to mark my pattern pieces by making a small snip within the seam allowance. However, because we are working with clear vinyl today, I don't want that little snip to be seen. So I will be making my mark using my air erase pen. The first thing that we need to do is attach our zipper. We're going to start by attaching it to the lower exterior front panel. I am going to be applying my zipper pull after my zipper tape is sewn in place and top stitched so that I can get a nice straight stitch line. But if you struggle to get your zipper pulls on, you can go ahead and place your zipper pull now. Just be sure to slide it out of the way when you're sewing so that you get a nice even line of stitches on either side of your zipper. Take your lower trim piece, if you are using one, and place it so that it is wrong sides down on the right side of your exterior. So you can see the front of your lower exterior piece and the front of your trim piece. The trim piece should be wide enough that it reaches all the way to the edge of your exterior lower front piece, so there may be a little bit of overhang there. Match it up so that the raw edge of your trim piece lines up with the raw edge of your lower front piece, and then take your zipper tape. You are going to lay your zipper tape so that it is right sides down, that is the side with the coils, on your exterior front. So you will have your exterior front right sides up, you will have your trim right sides up, and your zipper tape will be right sides down. You want to make sure that you are matching up all of your center markings and clip all of the layers together. I like to start at the center and work my way out, making sure that the edge of the zipper tape and the edge of that front piece remain lined up. I generally like to use double-sided tape when I'm installing my zippers. However, today I'm going to be using clips. If you use double-sided tape when you're sewing with clear vinyl and you try to remove the double-sided tape, you can get a sticky residue. If you choose not to remove it, then it can be seen on your finished project. So rather than use double-sided tape, I'm going to use clips, and I will be basting my zipper in place. Once you have the 3 layers clipped together, we are going to baste the zipper to the exterior lower front panel. We're going to sew from one end to the other at 1/8 of an inch, and we don't need to backstitch because we are initially just sewing a basting line of stitches. The reason that I am sewing a basting line of stitches through my exterior and my zipper tape is because I would like to install my zipper with my zipper foot. However, the zipper foot is not going to glide very well along this PVC vinyl. So I'm going to first secure the layers with a Teflon foot that I know can cope with the stickiness. And then once all of my layers are secured, I can sew with my regular metal zipper foot and know that I'm not going to get any shifting of my layers. Once that first row of stitches is in place, I can switch to my zipper foot. You can take some layers of the material that you're working with and do some tests with your presser foot and also with your thread tension and your stitch length to make sure that you're happy with the results with the settings that you're using. I'm now going to sew the first side of my zipper, and I like to use a seam allowance of 5/16 of an inch for a size 5 zipper, which is why I added that little bit extra to my lower exterior panel. Back stitching for this row of stitches and sewing straight along. When you have sewn your zipper seam, you can go ahead and remove your basting stitches so that you just have one row of stitches visible on your finished project. That is optional. You can leave those basting stitches in place if you wish. Once you've sewn the first side of your zipper, fold the seam allowance down towards the lower part of your exterior front section and make a crease in your exterior so that there is a fold next to your zipper tape. You can finger press or use a seam roller to make that crease. You can, if you choose, use double-sided tape to secure that seam allowance down. I am just going to hold mine in place, and then I'm going to top stitch below my zipper tape, and I'm also going to be top stitching around the entirety of that lower trim piece. When we're top stitching, we're going to back stitch in the side seam allowance and then sew all the way around this trim piece. We are going to first sew the folded edge of that trim piece. The reason that we're going to sew the folded edge first is so that the trim piece itself can sit nice and flat on the exterior. If you choose to sew the free edge of that trim piece before you sew next to the zipper, then your zipper tape may not lay properly flat on your finished project. I will be sewing around the entire rectangle using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to be using a longer stitch length and my Teflon foot so that the clear vinyl doesn't stick to my sewing machine. Increasing my tension and my stitch length as necessary, using my Teflon foot, making sure that my back stitches are hidden in the side seam, but not on the very edge of the trim piece that may get cut off, using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I will back stitch at the beginning in the side seam and then back stitch again when I meet back up with my starting point. With the lower part of the zipper fully sewn and top stitched, we can now attach the exterior front top section. We're matching up the centers when we attach our exterior front piece, but I still like to check that I have even spacing on either side of that exterior piece by checking the gap on the lower section. You can also at this point trim back any excess that you have at the end of your trim piece where it overhangs the edge of your lower exterior panel. The reason for trimming this now is so that you can see if you have correct placement of your upper exterior front section. When you're happy with your placement, you can sew the exterior top section to your zipper tape. First using a basting stitch length and sewing out 1/8 of an inch. Then switch over to your zipper foot and sew with the same seam allowance that you used to attach the first side of your zipper. I will be using 5/16 of an inch. Basting, making sure that the edge of the zipper tape and the edge of that top exterior front piece remain lined up. And sewing with the full seam allowance, back stitching. Fold that top section up and away from the zipper tape and press that flat and make sure that the spacing is even on either side of your zipper coils. When you're happy with that positioning, we can top stitch the fold the same way as we did on the lower side of our exterior front. This time we will be back stitching in the side seam at one end, sewing along next to our zipper coils, 1/8 of an inch from that fold using our longer top stitching stitch length, and then we will pivot to back stitch in the side seam at the other end of the zipper. We will not be sewing the whole way around like we did on the trim piece. With that top stitching done, we're ready to install our zipper pull. You can choose if you want to have the head of your zipper pointing to the left or the right side of the bag. I prefer to have mine so that it opens from the left-hand side, so I am going to apply my pull from the right side of my zipper tape. Take a look at your zipper tape and make note of which coil is sticking further out at the end of your zipper. This is the side that you're going to want to make sure you are starting on, and you want to ensure that the zipper coils are in the same order when you have finished installing your pull. If your coils don't go back together in the same order that they started in, you can get a bubble in your zipper tape. So it's important to make note of which side zipper tooth you want to be starting on. I will make sure that there is a link to my video specifically on applying zipper pulls in the video description. Once that zipper pull is on, we have finished with the exterior front section of the bag, and we can continue the rest of our construction. Retrieve your exterior back panel and lay it so that it is right sides together with your exterior front. You want to match up the lower edge of your exterior fronts right sides together. Place clips along the outside edge, and you want to make sure that the inside edge of that boxed corner on both the left and the right are matching up. And place an extra clip at the top to avoid any side-to-side shifting. We're now going to sew this exterior bottom seam using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, making sure that you are using the correct stitch length for your vinyl of choice. Using my Teflon foot and back stitching at the beginning and at the end. After sewing that exterior bottom seam, you can decide if you want to butterfly your seam open or if you're going to bind it. I am going to be adding binding to mine. However, if you do want to butterfly your seam open, what you will do is press the seam allowance open to either side of that central line, and then you will top stitch at 1/8 of an inch from that center bottom seam. Top stitching on either side of that center seam allowance will allow it to sit flat on the bottom of the bag. And then you can go ahead and sew your side seams. Rather than do this, I'm going to bind my raw seams. So retrieve one of your 8-inch pieces of waterproof canvas and fold it in half long ways so that the wrong sides are together, and crease that all the way along. Wrap your binding around the raw edge of that bottom seam and clip it in place. You want the very edge of that lower exterior seam to be tucked up into the fold of your waterproof canvas. We're going to sew this binding on at 3/8 of an inch, measuring from the outside fold of that binding piece. There will be a little bit of excess hanging over either side. This row of stitches will be sitting just inside on the seam allowance side of our center bottom seam. With that binding attached, fold it to the side and press it flat. Because of where the zipper tape is, I am going to be pressing my binding so that it is pointing towards the exterior front of my bag. That is because when I do my side seams, I'm going to want that binding to point towards the exterior back so that my zipper tape can sit more nicely at the side seam. If you have both of your pieces of binding pointing to the back, you are going to have a lot of bulk at your box corner. When I'm top stitching this bottom seam here, the tendency is going to be to fold it down onto the wrong side of the exterior and then top stitch down this edge. The problem with that is that there is a bit of bulk here with that PVC vinyl, and when I fold it flat, this other side is going to stick up, which is going to result in a bit of a roll in the bottom of the bag. So rather than sew that seam flat from the inside of my pouch, I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to flatten that bottom seam out, And then I'm going to top stitch along this edge from the outside. And I can see where I want to place my stitches because the vinyl is clear. What that will do is help this exterior to lay flat rather than bunch up underneath that bit of binding. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. I'm going to back stitch at the side here, pivot and top stitch 1/8 of an inch from the edge of my binding strip that I can see through the clear vinyl. You can leave this edge untop stitched if you prefer, but it does stand up a little in your finished bag, which is why I choose to top stitch mine flat. Trim your threads and trim any excess binding at the edge. You can trim it flush or you can just trim it back. You don't want to snip your stitches. And now we're going to sew around the rest of the exterior. Placing your material so that it is right sides together. Match up the lower edge at the boxed corner as your first point. Then smooth the exterior out and clip around the rest of the outside. Keep it as smooth as you can. It's possible that your upper edge doesn't match up quite perfectly because of the zipper installation. So keeping it smooth is more important than having the upper edge match up. If you have a slight mismatch there, that will be within the top seam allowance. So make sure that it is straight as a priority over having the top edge match up. So match up your corners and then keep it smooth at the sides and then smooth that out, and that will lay where it lays. If it can match up, then that's great, but because of the seam allowance, it's hard to say for sure. So the best thing to do is just keep it smooth at the sides and then clip it along the edge where you can, and then you will use the uncut piece, that's the exterior back, to determine where a seam allowance will be. If you're using clear vinyl, it sticks to itself a little, so you may need to lift it up and reposition to get the edges to line up. When you're happy with that, sew around the entire outside edge, double checking that your zipper pull is on. We're going to be back stitching at this lower corner and sewing all the way around. When we get to the top corner here, we're going to take it about 2 stitches at a time and then reposition our presser foot so that we get a nice even curve as we go around. Continue along the top and down the side and backstitch again at this end. You can add some extra stitches at the end of your zipper if you like, but we will be binding over the end of the zipper, so I am not too concerned about adding extra stitches there to keep the zipper pull on, because we will have an extra row of stitches when we attach the binding. We're using a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch. Switching back to my shorter stitch length, and while I'm not going to force the material under the presser foot, it does stick a fair bit, so I will help it through if I need to. Lifting it up slightly off the bed of the machine helps a lot with feeding it through. You also want to make sure that you are following the edge of your exterior panel to gauge your seam allowance. You can slide that zipper pull out of the way so that it doesn't cause that vinyl to pull away at the top there. And you can keep it flat so that you know your seam allowance is consistent. Trim your threads, and we're also going to trim the zipper tape flush at the edges of our bag. And if you have any of your trim hanging over, you can trim that off also. And what we're also going to do is trim back the seam allowance of the upper section. Before we do so, just check your stitches at the corners to make sure that you are happy with how tight they are and that your stitch line across the top is straight. If it isn't straight, you can add a second row of stitches just inside that stitch line to straighten it up. My tension here is maybe off a little. Around the curves, you sometimes need to increase your tension to hold that thread right out in the corner. So I'm just going to sew this particular corner here, once again, just around the curve. Just increase my tension slightly, just sewing that corner there. And backstitch again. And if you're still not happy, what you can do is just manually tighten that stitch line by tucking a needle underneath the threads and just tugging on them gently and moving the slack to one end, and that will help tighten those corner stitches. And that's looking a bit better. Take a pair of scissors, and what we're going to do is snip in just above the zipper tape and trim back this seam allowance. When you are snipping around the corner for it to curve on the inside of your bag, what you need to do is remove some of the bulk. You can do that by taking triangular snips at the corner, little wedges, and that will help that to sit nicely inside your finished pouch. If you don't like the look of the wedges, then you can trim your seam allowance to be about 1/8 of an inch, just around the curve there, and that will reduce the bulk in that corner also. I'm going to snip in just up from where the zipper tape is, and then you can do angled snips. These are not the best scissors, but I don't want to use my regular fabric scissors. You don't want the point of your triangle to be too close to your stitch line. So I'm just going to take small snips to show you that way. I'll try a different pair of scissors. Still not my favorite ones, but a bit sharper. And the reason for that is that when we turn the bag out, this vinyl at the corner will be tucked in here. And if you take those little wedges out, then they will sit more nicely inside that curve. We are not going to be putting any binding on this upper edge, so those will be seen with the clear vinyl. So that's something to consider if you prefer the look of just trimming the bulk back completely, which would remove those little wedge pieces at the edge there. It would just be trimmed to a rounded edge, which would still be able to tuck up nicely into the corner. Do the same on the other side, angling up away from the zipper. This is where our binding is going to end. And I'm also going to trim back the upper seam allowance. You can choose if you trim both of these or just one. We will be top stitching it from the other side to secure it down. I'm just going to trim back one layer to 1/8 of an inch, and that grading of that seam allowance can help it to sit more nicely on your finished bag also. But at the corner, you're going to want to trim both, whether you do it rounding that out, which will look like this, so that that is tucked inside that corner, or if you take the snips like this. Those are your two options for reducing that bulk. If you want, you can trim both layers. I've just trimmed one layer there. Now what we need to do is apply the binding to these side seams. We want the binding to extend from that limit of our zipper tape down to the boxed corner. I'm going to line one edge up here with the zipper tape, and I'll have some extra hanging off at the end that I can trim away. The other thing that you can do is take a snip off the corner at the lower edge there, and that will help reduce the bulk in your boxed corner. Take your remaining two longer strips of waterproof canvas, and you're going to fold it in half to make a center crease and press the fold. Then take your strip and line it up so that the upper edge is at the edge of the zipper tape just below where we've angled in our side seam, and wrap it around the raw edge of that seam allowance. Smooth it out with the outside edge of the seam allowance tucked up into that fold. Repeat for the other side. And now we're going to sew both of those strips of binding on the same way as we did for the lower piece of binding, sewing out 3/8 of an inch from the fold, sewing through the binding on both sides and the side seam, and our line of stitches will be hitting just inside our 3/8 of an inch seam allowance at the side. Back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and you're going to stop at the lower edge of this boxed corner, and when we're done we will trim this edge off. The strip of binding is just concealing the raw edge of our clear vinyl, so you can use a longer stitch length if you prefer. It's not a structural seam. Repeat for the second side. Trim back your threads and trim the extra binding at the lower edge. You can fold it over that corner to see where you need to snip it. Then open out your zipper, and we're going to box these lower corners. We want to fold this side seam towards the back, as that is the direction that the zipper is going to want to point. So we fold the side seam away from the side with the zipper, like so. And we're going to match up the fold in the bottom seam with the fold of the side seam. And you want them to butt up nicely against each other. If you butterflied open your bottom seam, then you're going to be matching up the side seam with the center seam, but it will be sitting a little flatter. Because mine is folded to opposite sides, the ridge of the seam pushes up neatly against the other. And you should have a fairly straight edge here. It should be nice and flat because the outside corners were squared up. If it's mismatched a little, the most likely cause is a slight difference in the seam allowance on your side and bottom seams. Or it could be when you were cutting, your squares weren't quite exact, which is particularly difficult with PVC. But you get it as close to flat as you can and then clip along this edge. If you have trouble positioning your vinyl, you can soften it by applying some heat from a hairdryer. Do the same on the other side, making sure that the bottom is flat. If you've top stitched it, that will be staying flat on its own, and that your side seam is pointing towards the back of your bag away from that zipper tape. Line up the seam, smooth it out, and you will have a straight corner there too. Any excess binding at the lower edge we can trim after we've sewn it. When we sew, we will be sewing 3/8 of an inch seam allowance from the edge of the vinyl. So if it is tricky for you to tell where that is, when you have the little bit of binding hanging over there, you can trim that before we sew. To keep it nice and flat, I like to also place a clip at the side here to hold everything where I want it to be. And you want to make sure that your seam is lined up all the way down here. They should stay flush with each other. You particularly want to make sure that it is straight at the point that you're going to be sewing your bottom boxed corner seam. So flatten it out, and we're going to sew along here and along here, back stitching at the beginning and at the end, and sewing one side at a time, back stitching using our shorter stitch length and taking care to help that PVC through the sewing machine if it's sticking to the bed. There's a bit of bulk there, so if you need a hump jumper as you come down, you can use that to help avoid any skipped stitches. Come up to the edge and back stitch. Repeat for the second side. Again, gauging your seam allowance from the edge of your boxed corner, not any of your overhanging binding. Check that you're happy with how straight that seam is, and then trim your threads. And then we will attach binding to those bottom corners to hide those last 2 raw seams. When you're trimming your threads, you can also trim back the excess binding if you need to. Take your 2 remaining strips of waterproof canvas and fold those in half, the same way as we did for the longer strips. And then you're going to fold it over that raw edge, wrap it around, and clip that in place. And we're just going to be covering up that boxed corner seam the same way as we did for the side and bottom seams. Sewing along at 3/8 of an inch from the folded edge. And you can backstitch just at the edge, making sure that your stitches are staying on your vinyl and not in this section that is overhanging, because we will be trimming that off. Switching to that longer stitch length if you like. Backstitch and sew along. You can feel where the edge is, so you know where to backstitch. Just keep your fingers clear of the needle. Trim your threads and trim the excess binding there. You can fold it over at the side so you can see where you're trimming, the same way as we did for the side seam. You can use a thread zapper or a lighter to singe any extra fuzziness or threads as you see fit. Now we need to turn it out. Once we turn it out, we're going to roll this top seam out, and then we will top stitch along that edge. In order to get the PVC to turn out, I suggest using a hairdryer to soften it up. If you try to turn it when it is cold, it's very difficult to get it out. It is possible, but you increase the chances of damaging your seams and crumpling your vinyl up. So I like to apply some heat from a hairdryer to make that PVC more supple, and then I can turn it out a lot more easily through my opening. Let's take a hairdryer. When you're happy with the suppleness of your vinyl, you can turn it out, being careful not to stretch it, as once it is softened, you can stretch a little. I'm going to focus first on turning out the bottom corners, and then I'm going to apply a bit more heat to that top seam so that I can turn that out and roll it ready to be top stitched. Poke out your corners, push that bottom boxed corner seam out. And now we just have this top edge to fold out also, so I'm going to soften that up a little more. It cools down pretty quickly, which means it firms back up. So you want to smooth out creases while it's still supple. So I'm going to soften that up and turn that out too. Gently push out at that corner. Do not use anything pokey, particularly when the vinyl is soft. You will poke through your vinyl. So just use your thumb, or if you really need something, use this rounded end, not the pointy end of a point turner. I do not recommend using a chopstick. I poked through the corner of one of these when I was having a trial run with just this part of a chopstick. If it's not coming out all the way, soften it up again and keep going, and then roll that upper seam. If you keep your pull in the middle, that can help get it nice and neat at the edges. And you can see that it wants to bow in here. That is because of the clear vinyl and how it likes to roll. So once we sew that seam across the top, that will sit a lot more nicely and a lot straighter, because it will be held into position like this rather than being left to its own devices, which makes it want to do this and bow in. This is actually a lot of the reason that you get bowing in on the straight lower edge of vinyl pouches, because the bulk and the structure of the vinyl causes it to roll up. So even if you have squared corners and you've sewn nice and straight, the vinyl rolling in is what causes that bowing in on the bottom seam of your bag, which is something that I'm going to address in a future tutorial. But as I'm sure you're aware, I have a lot more ideas than I have time. So these things will be coming soon, TM. To soften that up a little bit more to try to get that corner to poke out. This one that is poked out more easily is the one where I trimmed the bulk away entirely. This one that I'm having a little bit more trouble with is the one with the wedges. So that's something to consider on your version of this if you want to just do the trimming back compared to the wedges, and it may make it easier to get that corner out. You can always trim back a little extra when you're turning it out if you find that you are not getting quite the shape that you want. So I'm just going to trim this. See if that helps. When you're happy with your corners, roll out that top seam and place some clips along the upper edge. And you want to roll it out so that you can see right around where your stitches are. And then you know that you've got the seam at the very top. If you're having trouble rolling it out, you can soften it up again. And once it's flat, we're going to be sewing around this upper edge. We're going to be sewing from just below this curve all the way around to just below the curve on the other side. On my sewing machine, it's kind of tricky to start at this end with the bulk of the zipper. So I'm actually going to start partway along, sew around to below the curve on this side, and then I'm going to go back the other way. I'm going to start and stop with long tails, and then I will be tucking the tails between the layers of the clear vinyl to finish it up without any back stitching. Longer stitch length and keeping it as flat as possible. And I'm sewing around 1/8 of an inch. My stitch line will be hitting just outside the edge of where that trimmed vinyl is from the exterior and sewing through the seam allowance of the front. Get slowly as you get to the corner, pivot, and finish up. And then I'm going to stitch the other way, this time from the back. I do my best to get the needle in the same hole that I started in with long tails. Hand crank the first stitch if I need to. And try to match the height of the finishing stitch on the second side compared to the first side. I've sewn around the entire upper edge. I have 2 tails at each side, and I have 4 tails in the middle where I stopped and restarted my stitching. And what I want to do is tuck these threads through to the inside of my bag so that you can't see the knot on the outside. I don't want to snap the thread, so what I'm going to do is just poke the needle through the hole. You don't want to poke it through the exact hole because then you will lose a stitch. Poke the needle through, then thread your tail through the eye of your needle and then pull it through to the inside. Do the same on the back. The back with the clear vinyl, it's a little bit easier to see where that stitch is. So feed both of those threads through to the inside, and then I can knot those together to secure the threads. I'm going to do the same at the other end. And it's helpful to have the tails on the same side of your side seam so that you can tie them snugly together and not be tying them around that bit of binding there. You can use pliers to help get your needle through the bulk if you need to. save your fingers. The tail through, needle through the rest of the way, and then knot both of those thread pairs together. You're going to tie it as tight as you can and then trim it down to about 1/4 inch. Steer clear of that zipper pull. Just get it as close as you can, and then you can trim it. And we're going to do the same thing for these threads here. It's a little easier to see where these ones are because they're not hidden up at the side. I'm going to try to pull them all through to the inside of your bag. And you can see where the stitch is jumping across. That's where you want to just tuck your needle underneath the stitch to pull the tail through. But again, it's a little tricky with the stickiness of the clear vinyl, so using a needle by poking it into one of the stitch holes works just as well. Then take that last bundle of threads, knot the 4 together. The knot will stay pretty well tucked up within that fold at the top there. And trim that down. And then you're all finished. You can heat up that PVC again if you need to get it to sit nice and smoothly. You can see that the bottom of the pouch, you have the ridge where it's folded over, but it still is fairly flat compared to this one that is rolling quite a lot at the base. So when you stand them up, the one where we have sewn the base tends to sit a little flatter. It's not super significant, but it is just a little bit of a difference there. But you can do it by butterflying that seam. You can top stitch the binding to one side, or you can just leave it as it is, like I did on this one. But I do find that that seam sticking up at the bottom can be a little bit bothersome, whereas on this one, you can see that it is sitting nice and flat. I'll make sure that there is a link to purchase the pattern if it is something that you wanted to try out yourself in the description of this video. And be sure to check out the MyUno pattern tutorials from my fellow Marathon Sewciety tutorialists throughout the day today, or catch them at a later date if you are watching this after the day of the event. Hope that helps. Thanks, everyone.